and our budget more sustainable over time. And with that, I'm happy to take some questions. We'll start up the back and then come down to Greg and then Tom and then Ben.
Treasurer, the UK has had an exemption from some of Donald Trump's steel and aluminium tariffs. They're now only going to have the 25% one instead of the doubled 50% levy. What do you make of that? Does that give Australia more hope of securing its own carve-out from those levies?
Well, I don't take any outcomes for granted when it comes to that engagement we've got with the Americans. We've made it very clear what we think about those tariffs. And so we will continue to engage as the friends in the UK have and most countries have, trying to get the best deal that we can for our people and for our industries. That's the approach we've adopted to here, and it'll be the approach we'll take from here as well. Greg, then Tom, then Ben.
Treasurer, are you willing to drop the unrealised capital gains component of your proposed superannuation tax reforms and negotiate a new model with the coalition?
Well, first of all, I'm not convinced that the coalition wants to have a conversation about these changes. I think we all saw what Matt Canavan, for example, said today about these changes. I think even on the same day that Ted O'Brien was occupying real estate in your paper, the finance spokesman was saying something completely different. So first of all, well, can I just finish my answer, Greg? So first of all, you know, I'm not convinced that they are fair income when it comes to bipartisanship. I don't think they're being real about that. When it comes to the comments that the Prime Minister made yesterday and reported in your paper today, I think they're important points, obvious points, self-evident points. First of all, that we don't have the numbers on our own in the Senate to pass any of our legislation, including this legislation, so there's always an element of engagement. Second point that the Prime Minister made, again reported accurately in your piece today, is that there are a number of opportunities for the coalition to behave in a bipartisan way, including efforts to cut student debt and some of the other things that they've opposed. And so let's see that bipartisanship beyond an interview in a newspaper which contradicts the comments made by other senior colleagues in his coalition parties. Now, on the point more broadly about unrealised gains, I mean, it is important to remember that these changes were announced almost 2.5 years ago now. We did multiple rounds of consultation and we said to people, if there is a better, fairer way of making this calculation, tell us about it. The unrealised gains calculation was recommended to us by Treasury. We provided years of opportunities for people to suggest different ways to calculate that liability, and nobody has been able to come up with one. And so that's an important bit of perspective as well. Now, when it comes to the issue more broadly, this is a change which is modest. It is methodical. As I said, it's been on the books for years now, and it makes a meaningful difference to the budget. And it helps us fund some of our other priorities. It's all about making sure that the superannuation system is fairer, that it's more sustainable. It only impacts about 0.5% of people with superannuation accounts. And so we put this proposal out there some years ago. There have been multiple occasions for people to propose alternative ways of calculating the liability. This is the way recommended by Treasury, and it's the way that we intend to proceed. Treasurer, Tom, then Ben.
Question on two different budget headaches. Chris Minns has had some comments in recent days about tobacco excise. Obviously, that revenue's falling away. What's your view on whether a change is needed? And secondly, on defence spending, the US suggestion of 3.5% of GDP, that quite a lot, of course, for you to fit into the budget. From a budget perspective, what's your view on that?
Look, two important questions. I mean, first of all, I'm not proposing to cut taxes on cigarettes to make them cheaper for people. We've seen tax revenue for cigarettes come down for two reasons. One of them's a good reason, one of them's a bad reason. The good reason is fewer people smoking. The bad reason is we know that we've got a challenge when it comes to illegal tobacco. That's why we've provided two substantial amounts of money in two consecutive budget updates to work with the states on compliance. And so I respectfully disagree with Chris. He's a friend of mine. I work closely with Premier Minns. I don't think the answer here is to make cigarettes cheaper for people. I think the answer here is to get better at compliance, and the feds have come to the table. I have, and Mark Butler has, and the relevant ministers like Tony Burke and others have come to the table with hundreds of millions of dollars in new funding to try and combat the scourge of illegal tobacco. On defence spending, we're already making a very substantial increase in investment in our budgets, and we're proud to be doing that. We'll see defence spending as a share of GDP rise substantially. I think about $10 or $11 billion in extra spending in tight budgets over the course of the forward estimates. I think 50 billion plus from memory over the course of the next 10 years. And so we've made room for substantial new and increased investment in defence spending. There will always be calls to do more. There will always be people who say we should spend more on defence. There'll be a lot of people who say we should spend less on defence. We're doing what we can to responsibly and substantially increase defence spending in our budgets. Ben, and then next year, and then there. And then to Andrew at the front.
Almost since the day you came to office, you have been asked about major tax reform, about making big tax reform. When will big tax reform come? Where's the big tax reform? At the same time, we're entering almost the second year of a big campaign against your superannuation changes, which, as you've said, affect not every Australian household. Given the reaction to these superannuation changes that's been in the community, do you think that makes the challenge of even larger tax reform that may even affect every Australian even more difficult and potentially impossible?
Well, that remains to be seen. I mean, it doesn't augur well for bigger, broader tax reform when such a modest and methodical change is being resisted in some quarters. I think we should resist the temptation to think that because overwhelmingly two media outlets don't like this change, to assume that concern is kind of broadly and deeply felt in the Australian community. We're talking about 0.5% of people with superannuation being impacted, people with more than $3 million balances. And what it means, and what I could have said if in the answer to Greg's question as well, don't forget, the concessions here are still very generous. You know, we're not eliminating tax concessions for people with big balances. We're still providing very substantial tax breaks, just slightly less substantial. You know, if someone's got $3 million in super by one set of assumptions, their superannuation tax concession before this change is a bit over $14,000. After this change, a bit over $13,000. So still very generous tax concessions for people with big balances in super. I think that there's an issue here when it comes to tax reform. A lot of people say they're in favour of tax reform in the abstract, but they very rarely, if ever, support it in the specific. And I think there's an element of that playing out here as well. I also think, and this coheres your question with Tom's a moment ago as well, you know, a lot of the same people say we need to dramatically increase defence spending, we need to dramatically cut the company rate, we need to abandon the changes to make superannuation tax concessions fairer, and we need to deliver bigger surpluses. Often it's the same people saying that, if you can believe it. And so my job and Katie's job and the Cabinet, the government's job, is to make it all add up. Sometimes that involves decisions which not everybody likes, and obviously I understand that not everybody likes this change. But we have to do what's right and responsible, and I'm confident that this is.
That people are opposing, not so much the gaining more revenue through superannuation, but the actual model of unrealised.
Well, first of all, I'm not convinced that's right, Greg. I mean, I'm not convinced that's right. I think some of this opposition comes from people who would like the extremely generous tax concessions, not the slightly less extremely generous tax concessions, to be fair. And we've given people multiple opportunities to propose alternatives to this calculation. It's also important to remember that this calculation of unrealised gains exists elsewhere in the tax system, multiple places in the tax system. It's not new that this is the way that we are proposing to calculate it. Treasury proposed it to us. We did multiple rounds of consultation. People will say it's about the the calculation, some people will say it's about the indexation, but I think in a lot of instances, again, respectfully to you and to people making these comments, and I welcome people making a contribution to the national economic debate, but I think a lot of it is not really about the method of calculation. Here, and then there, and then Andrew, then John, and then we'll come over to this side.
Can you confirm that the tax on $3 million superannuation funds will only apply to the Prime Minister once he leaves office, that he won't pay any extra tax on his superannuation until he leaves office under your legislative proposal?
I'm so pleased you asked me this question because people have been lying about this. We've had people, I think shamefully, say that the Prime Minister or other senior politicians at the federal level on defined benefits are somehow exempt from this change. They are not. We made that clear that they are included in the legislation we released in November 2023 and in the regulations we released, I think, in March of 2024, more than a year ago. It's been abundantly clear in black and white that the Prime Minister is included here and people should stop lying about it. Now, to the substance of your question, which I do understand, you're making a more specific point about the calculation. We've been clear about how defined benefits would be treated since we announced the policy. Just as the previous government did with their changes to super, we apply commensurate treatment to defined benefit interests to ensure that there are equivalent tax outcomes. And the same rules apply to everyone on defined benefit schemes without the constitutional exemption, including federal politicians. Now, when it comes to the deferred liability, which is the very specific kernel of your question, these deferred liabilities on defined benefits are consistent with the long-standing approach taken in other areas of super, like the extra contributions tax for high-income earners. Tax liabilities are deferred until the pension phase because members in those schemes can't access their super to pay tax debts until that point. It's a function of necessity that's how that calculation is made, but we charge an interest rate on those liabilities to make sure that people don't receive an inappropriate advantage from the necessity of calculating and paying those liabilities on retirement. And so you have to be very careful with what some people, including I think some of the lower echelons of our political opponents, some of the things that they've said, and unfortunately some of those things which have been reported as fact. You have to be very careful here. Defined benefit schemes like the Prime Minister's are in. They've been in all along. The calculation reflects the same sorts of ways it's been calculated in the past. And because the liability is paid on retirement, there's an interest rate applied to it to make sure that there's no inappropriate benefit. And I genuinely really appreciate the opportunity to clear all of that up because too much has been written about that, which has been wrong. So we're going to go over here. No, mate. We're going to go over here, then we'll go Andrew, then we'll go John, and then we'll go Matthew.
Just on the Australian-US relationship, we've spent the last 6 months talking about how tariffs, whether they're on or off, are causing havoc across all of the world's economies, really. Can we afford to keep kind of trying to meet the demands of the US now they're calling for defence spending increases, and should Australia be looking elsewhere?
I think the Prime Minister did a terrific job of explaining our approach to this. I think it was yesterday or it might have been the day before in Perth when he said that we'll determine our defence priorities and we'll fund the capability that we need in a world that is becoming more dangerous. And our funding for defence is determined by our government. We obviously take into considerations what's happening in the world and the views of our allies and partners, but our decisions about defence funding are made in this room, in this cabinet room and in the national security room next to it as well. The world is a dangerous place. It's dangerous in security terms, it's dangerous in economic terms as well. And so I think one of the kind of defining influences on this second term of this Albanese government will be what is shaped by global circumstances, certainly in the defence sphere, but in the economic sphere as well. I was speaking to a very large American investor this morning about trying to attract more capital here, whose decisions may be influenced by the unpredictability and the volatility in the US. And so All of this churn and change in the global economy is obviously very concerning for us, but also an opportunity for us. And we intend, as we have been doing throughout, we intend to try and be beneficiaries of all that change rather than victims of it. I think I said Andrew, John, Matthew.
Treasurer, as you've acknowledged, the Trump effect is subduing growth, but what are the opportunities for Australia amongst Trump's tariff war?
Well, I think a lot of global investors are rethinking their investment strategies, and without going into the details of private or commercial in confidence conversations, including a great conversation I had this morning that I referenced before, there is a global scramble for capital because people are rethinking their investment strategies. You can see in the American bond prices, for example, that people are rethinking their approach to the American economy. And so I think primarily for me, my focus, including today, was how do we get that capital deepening that we want to see to make our economy more productive. Foreign investment from trusted sources has a really important role to play there, and the opportunity for Australia as a country with, you know, wonderful human capital, stable government, you know, big opportunities in the energy transformation, big opportunities in technology and data, you know, an economy that's grown despite all the challenges thrown at it. You know, we've got a very compelling story to tell the world, and there is a big global scramble for capital, and we will be a very competitive part of that.
So, Treasurer,
John, then Matthew.
Thanks, Treasurer. Just on the national accounts,
Yeah.
Investment in machinery and equipment has fallen 3.7% over the last year, and you rightly point out that productivity remains flat. I think most people agree that business investment is the thing that's needed to require to lift productivity. What is the government's plan to lift business investment to get productivity going?
Yeah, so we've got quite a substantial reform agenda already underway, but we are prepared to contemplate, you know, next additional steps when it comes to attracting investment. You know, I strengthened and streamlined the foreign investment review process. The feedback I got today and this discussion I had earlier is that that is working to speed up, strengthen, but also streamline and speed up the FIRB process. That's part of it. Also, the work that we're doing on the single front door to try and concierge investment in major economy-changing projects in our country, recognising that the time it takes for approvals can be too long. I think Andy Lee gave a great contribution on this front. I think it was earlier this week when he was talking about the abundance agenda. You know, something that thinking's been very influential in our circles. This idea that if we want good things to happen in our economy, we need to make it easier for those good things to happen faster, more efficiently. So the single front door is part of that effort as well. All the work I'm doing on competition policy, unilaterally and with the states, the productivity fund, all of this is about making Australia a more attractive destination for investment. If you think about the major challenges we have in productivity, even though the level of business investment I think is the highest it's been in 12 years, growth rates, including today in the national accounts, were not especially strong. And we're not making the most of these deep, available pools of domestic and international capital. And if we do a better job of making the most of that, we will make our economy more productive over time, not overnight, but over time. And so that is a huge, huge part of the work that I've been doing in the month or so since we've been re-elected, but before that as well. And if people come to us with great ideas, whether it's about attracting investment, capital deepening, making our economy more productive, then we've got a very open door and open mind to those suggestions. Matthew.
Just running through the good things of the economy. Unemployment's down, inflation's back in target,
Yeah.
interest rates coming down,
Yeah.
GDP's still positive. Things are actually pretty good on a fair analysis of what is going on. But usually when things, the only thing that's out of kilter is that usually governments run surpluses when things are good like this. You're probably going to be one of Labor's longest serving treasurers. Do you think you'll ever see a surplus again in your time? And can I ask, is this as good as it gets for the Australian economy? Does it only sort of soften and get worse from here, or what are you trying to sort of soften the ground for?
Well, first of all, while you're away, Matthew, I knocked out a couple of surpluses, and that's the first time that's happened for almost 2 decades. So, I like to see that acknowledged sometimes. That was a combination of savings and banking most of the upward revision to revenue. Those are choices that governments make. And if we'd adopted the approach of our predecessors, those surpluses wouldn't have happened. So let's not dismiss those 2 surpluses that Katie and the Cabinet and I worked very hard to deliver. I think it's self-evident that the pressures on our budget are intensifying rather than easing. I do acknowledge that. I think one of the things, partly as an aside, which you may have noticed or you will notice in the course of the afternoon pouring through the national accounts data, we're actually making really good progress in areas like the NDIS. One of the reasons why public demand fell in the quarter is because of the progress we're making on the NDIS, aged care as well, even with the developments that Mark and Sam announced this morning. We're making progress there. We're making progress on interest costs. But overall, the pressures on the budget are intensifying rather than easing. Of course, we don't ignore that. Your question about is this as good as it gets, I think is my view is that I am quite optimistic about the future of our economy. There are some temporary factors in this quarterly outcome. There's natural disasters in here, not just Alfred, but the flooding in Townsville and Cairns and the surrounding communities earlier in the year, the fall in public demand because some of the big state projects came off. There are some temporary factors in here as well, and so we shouldn't overinterpret that March data. But growth is softer than we would like it to be, and I'm confident that growth will accelerate in our economy. Even if you look at that OECD report, you would have pored over it, Matthew. What it said was there was a little downgrade for growth this year for Australia, but actually an upgrade in growth for 2026. And so the rest of the world looks at Australia. It's an experience familiar to me from the GFC. Most of the rest of the world looks at Australia and they see low unemployment, lower inflation, interest rates coming down, real wages and incomes growing. Debt to GDP is much smaller here than in most other countries. We've knocked out those 2 surpluses. Most of the rest of the world sees what's happening in Australia and they think that there are some very good things happening in Australia. And this is part of the story, to link your question with John's, part of the story that we tell the world. It's a compelling story. But I firmly believe that there are good reasons to be optimistic about our economy. If I believed that Australia had peaked or this was the best that we could hope for, I wouldn't be here. We might go from the front up to the back. I'm sort of deliberately going long, but I won't be offended if people excuse themselves. Shane, and then behind you.
Treasurer, just to follow on from Tom's question, tobacco consumption fell 6.4% for the quarter,
Yeah.
almost 16% over the year for households. Do you actually believe that? Is that because that's not being reflected in what's going on in the streets of Sydney and Melbourne and Queensland? And do you think that there is a causation effect between the increases in tobacco excise and what's going on? Are you going to end up like Elliot Ness going, oh look, we can't control it. We can police it, but you can't control it.
Well, first of all, I did notice obviously the substantial decline in tobacco in the national accounts. We have to resist the temptation to think it's either 100% people giving away the darts, or 100% illegal activity. I think, as I acknowledged in my response to Tom's good question, it's both of those things. One of those developments is very good. One of those developments is very challenging. We're not ignoring it. We're not kind of dismissing it in the way that the end of your question implied. Hundreds of millions of dollars in compliance, because we do acknowledge that this is a real challenge. More people are giving up the darts, but more people are also doing the wrong thing. I'm not convinced that cutting the excise on cigarettes would mean that would be the end of illegal activity.
But would continually increasing excise just add to the financial incentive for people to go buy illegal cigarettes?
I know that that's a view put forward, but I don't share that view. I don't propose to be cutting taxes on cigarettes. I don't propose to be making cigarettes cheaper. It is a substantial public health challenge still in our economy. It's also a law and order challenge, and we're addressing both of those things simultaneously.
Might you freeze excise, Treasurer? Might you freeze, rather than cutting it, freezing it? Because the two are related, illegal activity and excise.
It's not something we've been considering, yeah.
Earlier you said the Coalition haven't offered any alternative proposals to the super tax changes, but the Greens have proposed an alternative around indexing the threshold. Are you open to good faith negotiation with the Greens to change the model to say that achieves the same outcome but addresses one of those concerns that's been put forward? Or are you determined to push it through without any change?
Oh, our preference is to push it through without any changes. The timing of that is to be determined. And unless I missed an announcement, I'm not sure that there's a shadow Treasury spokesperson yet in the Greens team. If there is, you know, at some point between now and the Parliament going back, obviously we engage with the Parliament in an effort to pass our legislation. But my preference, my intention, is to pass the changes that we have proposed. I'll obviously engage in a respectful way with the crossbench in the Senate, because as the PM said yesterday or the day before, and as I repeated today, we don't have the numbers on our own in the Senate. So there's always an element of discussion to try and get our legislation passed. We might just try and, actually Claire's had her hand up a bit. We might start Claire and come back.
Just returning to, you briefly mentioned the changes to aged care being delayed.
Yeah.
A couple of questions on this issue. Presumably it means that Australians will not start paying more for their aged care for another 4 months than you were originally planning. So what impact does that have on revenue?
Yeah.
Also, the government voted multiple times against amendments put forward by the Coalition to have a 12-month transition period for this legislation. There's been warnings for months that this was not ready to go. There's been complaints the whole way through. So is this not a failure on the government's part to actually have communicated effectively the information that the sector needed to be able to implement the changes on July 1?
Yeah, well, I think Mark and Sam have been through most of the answers to your question earlier today. In terms of the fiscal impact, we'll update that in the usual way in the mid-year budget update. But a delay like this is likely to cost in the order of $900 million over the forward estimates. And I think we've done this in good faith, out of necessity. It wasn't ready to go, and so we've got a responsible delay here. But we shouldn't forget that even with this modest delay, the changes that were worked up by Annika and Mark and being implemented by Sam and Mark are really important changes to make our budget more sustainable. You think about those areas where there is substantial pressure on the budget, areas like aged care, like the NDIS, like interest costs. We have made good progress, and so even with this delay that Mark and Sam have announced today, these are really important reforms. They're really important for the budget. Most importantly of all, they will help ensure that we deliver the standard of care that older Australians need and deserve. Okay, we'll come back through. Tom, Mark, up the back, and then come back here.
Just briefly, you've acknowledged that you can't pass legislation by yourself in the Senate. The Greens are
I
obviously...
don't think that's new news, Tom.
No, of course,
Yeah.
but in the context of 3 million super, the Greens have said indexation or a 2 million threshold. Any interest on the threshold, you'll probably have to compromise somewhere.
Really the same answer as I gave before. My preference and my intention is to legislate the package that we proposed more than 2 years ago. The legislation and regulations we made available, 18 months and a year ago. That's my preference. That's my intention. I think pointing out that we don't have the numbers on our own in the Senate is just a reflection of the reality. I'll have a discussion with the crossbench, with the Greens at some point between now and when the Parliament returns. Mark?
Treasurer, in the months before the election, Australians heard you say that the economy had turned a corner and better days were ahead. I'm just wondering with your comments just then that the pressures are increasing and not easing on the budget, are the better days still ahead but just a bit further off?
it remains the case that the Australian economy is turning a corner as the global economy is taking a turn for the worse. It's still the case. There are some temporary factors playing out in this March quarter, as I said, natural disasters, state public demand, the conclusion of big projects in some state budgets, for example. But overwhelmingly, our economic story in Australia is a story of relative economic strength. You know, I've had the opportunity to speak with a number of my colleagues over the course of, international colleagues and counterparts over the course of the last 2 months or so, and they all look at the kind of data that we're getting as a good thing. And I think I'm having a discussion with my new Canadian counterpart tomorrow morning at 7 a.m. And so the Australian story is a compelling one. The economic story is a story of economic strength, as I said before, that combination of, you know, lower inflation, very low unemployment, higher wages and incomes, interest rates coming down, debt's come down. We haven't had a negative quarter of growth. You know, in the context of what we're seeing around the world, those are very decent outcomes, better than that. And so I still am very firmly optimistic about the future of our economy, despite all of these very substantial global economic headwinds. We have a lot of advantages that a lot of other countries don't have. I think I said...
it seems the Australia was spared the letter that the US and other countries asking for their best offer on a trade deal. Just quickly, what would your elevator pitch be to the US President about why we need a better deal and soon?
Well, I'm unlikely to see him in an elevator, but the point that we have made repeatedly is that ours is a relationship of mutual economic benefit. We are different to a lot of these other countries that the Americans are negotiating with in that, apart from some unusual quarterly outcomes, overwhelmingly they've run a big trade surplus with us. And so we're different. It's a relationship of mutual economic benefit. And we see these tariffs and trade tensions as self-defeating. I mean, I really encourage you to read that OECD piece of work that came out yesterday afternoon. It really lays out, I think, in quite confronting ways, the costs and consequences of these escalating trade tensions. And even in a world where some of these tariffs get unwound, when you speak to global investors like I do as part of my job, it's the unpredictability as well that is buffeting people's investment intentions and the global economy more broadly. And so I would say to the Americans publicly what we say to them privately. It's a relationship of mutual economic benefit. We are different to a lot of the other countries that they are negotiating with. And we overwhelmingly, to be blunt about it, see these tariffs as a very bad development for the American economy, for the global economy, for the regional economy, and we won't be immune from that. Chloe, and then we'll come back to Jason, and then Katina.
Just following on from both of those two last questions, amid all this global uncertainty, you say that Australia has still turned the corner and you're optimistic about things ahead. But if you can put that into context, for the everyday Australian, are living standards going to get better, worse, or the status quo for the rest of this year? Living standards are getting better. And, you know, one of the stunning positive components of these national accounts is that we've got the most appropriate measure of living standards growing at 1.7%. They were falling 1.7% when we came to office. We finished last year, the second half of last year, where living standards in Australia were growing faster than the OECD average, growing, I think, around twice the G7 average, the measure of living standards. And if you look at the Treasury forecasts in the budget, they expect growth in living standards to accelerate. And that's because of the progress that we've made as Australians together. You know, the measure of living standards reflects inflation coming down very substantially. It reflects interest rates coming down. It reflects the tax cuts. It reflects the progress we've made on wages, and what a sensational outcome yesterday was for a fifth of the workforce relying on awards in our economy. And so this is not accidental, this is deliberate. You know, this is our economic plan lifting living standards in our economy, and we expect that
to continue. We acknowledge that people are doing it tough still, that they're still under pressure. We acknowledge the big hole that people were in when we came to office, and we've worked our tails off to try and turn that around. And we're seeing in these national accounts data that is being turned around. Now, we acknowledge, as I have probably 30 or 40 or 50 times in your presence, that sometimes or often how people feel and fare in the economy doesn't match the aggregate national numbers that we see in the national accounts, but you'd rather them heading up than heading down. They're heading up now under us, they were heading down under our predecessors, and the fact that they're heading up now is deliberate, not accidental. It's gradual, but it's important.
Treasurer,
Jason.
are you concerned that the Prime Minister might be about to poach Stephen Kennedy to lead Prime Minister and Cabinet?
A little. But I don't know. I mean, he's, I pay tribute to Glyn Davis in the first instance. Glyn Davis and I go way, way back. I was a researcher for Glyn in the Premier's Department in the late 1990s. And I've just got a mountain of respect for Glyn Davis. I'm personally sorry to see him go. He is a person of towering intellect. He is a massive brain who made a huge contribution in this gig that he's leaving shortly, but also, over a lifetime of service. And so I pay tribute to Glyn in the first instance. I see the speculation about candidates for that role that Glyn is vacating. No doubt the Prime Minister's considering a handful of wonderful people. I'm very fortunate that I get to work with Stephen Kennedy. And the decisions about the secretaries are decisions for the Prime Minister in consultation with us. And no doubt before long he'll make his views clear.
Treasurer, just back on defence spending, the sorts of increases that our comparable countries are looking at would be for us in the order of 40 billion a year. Joel Fitzgibbon was out publicly a month ago saying, he worried that there wasn't an appetite in Australia to do what needs to be done on defence to get ready for what's coming in the not too far future. But do you think, is that sort of money, 40 billion a year, is that even feasible in the economic environment that we have at the moment? Well,
it's a substantial amount of investment. I think one of the unfortunate things about this, I respect Joel's view obviously, and I know, and Kim Beazley and others, I know that there will be a constituency always for more defence spending. There will also be a substantial constituency for less defence spending. We get pressure, we get pushed and pulled in both directions when it comes to defence spending, and our job, our responsibility, which we embrace, is to try and make the right decisions for the right reasons, and recognising the global environment is tricky. The global environment in security terms and economic terms is dangerous. And that's why we are substantially increasing investment in our defence capability. We've sat in here for hours and hours and hours on end, finding room in budgets to make very substantial increases to defence spending, and that's because we share the view overall that defence spending needs to rise, and that's why it's rising in the budgets, the 4 budgets that we've handed down. Is that everyone? Thanks very much, guys. Thank you. Appreciate it, guys. Thank you.